All right. So, what do we mean by a guilt-free dessert? Well, I don't know if you can ever get it down to where it's not any guilt at all. I mean, I don't think you should feel guilty about eating anything personally, but as long as you're eating it in moderation. But a lot of people, have that, oh, I had too much dessert. I shouldn't have eaten all that dessert. So, a guilt-free dessert would be a dessert that uses fewer processed ingredients, uses fewer added sugars, uses more wholesome and nutritious ingredients, and does not sacrifice flavor for nutrition. A lot of times when you call them healthy desserts, people think it's just like an apple with, you know, that's about it. It's like nothing sweet, nothing with chocolate, nothing with frosting, and that's not necessarily true. I wouldn't say we're going to be able to make it so healthy that you can swap it for your normal balanced meal, but it's certainly going to improve the nutritional quality of some of our desserts in terms of being able to increase fiber and protein and decrease some of the sugars. So, tip number one would be you don't have to swap flavor for fewer calories. In many cases, if you just use the lower fat versions of some of the ingredients that are called for, especially in older recipes that may have been passed down through generations, and back when our grandmother, great grandmother, great great grandmother was the one making these, they didn't probably have like skim milk or didn't use it, or low fat cream cheese, or those kinds of ingredients, or they didn't think about using them. And so you can so often just swap out the lower calorie, lower fat, lower sugar versions of those kinds of ingredients in order to cut back on some of the calories, and it still tastes good. A lot of the products that are now lower fat these days have a better flavor profile than they used to. It's not always going to be like, I wouldn't recommend in baking that you swap skim milk out for whole milk or 2%, because there's not enough, a lot of times there's not enough fat in the product to make it that thick, creamy consistency that you want. But you can go from, say, 2% to 1% or whole milk to 2% and still get a good flavor. So the second tip would be just kind of tricking your brain into thinking you're eating more than you are. And people we're like, I never thought of it that way. But dinner plates over the years have gotten bigger. So dinner plate, you probably used to be like a dessert plate that we have now. And now they're like these huge monstrosities. And we feel like if we can still see the plate, we're not getting our money's worth, right? So we have to be able to like cover it up. I don't know how many of you have been to professional meetings, especially when there's a buffet and you're in line and you're like, either have more than one plate or you just have stuff stacked this high on it because you're like, man, I want to make sure I get my fair share. Yeah, that can be a tough habit to break. But if you just take a small portion and put it on a smaller plate, it covers more of the plate and it looks like more. And that could be a trick that could work for some people. Instead of taking like a little piece of dessert and putting it on a big dinner plate, and you have all that empty space, and you're thinking, that's it, that's all I'm getting. Or a big bowl and you have one scoop of ice cream in it, you can just downsize the size of the container that it's in, and it looks more full and it looks like you're eating more. So that's a way to um, lower some, lowering small, decreasing portion size will help you lower some of your caloric intake. And again, sometimes it's just about tricking your brain. The first thing that we do when we eat is we look at it. And if it looks appetizing, we're going to eat it. And if it doesn't look appetizing, we probably won't eat it. Or if it doesn't look like we're getting enough to satisfy us, our brain's going to tell us that we need more. So you kind of want to trick that. And also eating more slowly. Everyone knows this trick, I think, by now. But if you eat slower, now this is dessert, you presumably have already eaten, so you're not like feeling super hungry. But if you do eat slower, then your brain has a chance to catch up to your stomach. And if you listen to your body and stop eating when you don't feel hungry anymore, that's going to go a long way as well. So the third tip would be fruits are naturally sweet and make a delicious and healthy foundation for many desserts. So the goal here in terms of making your desserts more healthy is to try to decrease the amount of added sugars that we put in it. So if you look at a food label these days, added sugars are actually required to be on there now. That was just a fairly recent development in terms of food labels, but you'll see like total carbohydrates and it'll say fiber, sugar, and then total added sugar. And we're trying to avoid that added sugar as much as we can in order to lower some of the caloric value of some of these desserts. Now, fruit is a naturally, they have sugars that naturally occur in them. So if you use fruits in your desserts, you can get that sweetness without having to add additional sugar in most cases. And of course, fruit goes great with chocolate, but most things do, in my opinion. But the fourth tip would be when baking desserts at home, you can replace oil with applesauce at a 1-to-1 ratio in most things that you're going to make. So that's a great way to reduce calories and fat. And no, it doesn't make everything taste like apples. I get that question a lot. Well, if you use applesauce or prune puree is another one. If you're making a dark colored dessert, you can use prune puree. And that'll actually add fiber while at the same time lowering sugar. And it doesn't make everything taste like prunes. So it's one of those neat tricks that will give you the consistency that you want in the final product without, jacking up the sugar. But you'd want to make sure that you're using the applesauce that is unsweetened. Otherwise, you're just adding those added sugars back in. So you'd want to look on the label of the jar of applesauce, or you can make your own applesauce, because that's always a possibility, because I know who does that every single day, right? Some people probably do, but I don't. So if you're buying it from the store, you want to look at the label and make sure you're getting the unsweetened applesauce if you're going to try that. It really works good with quick breads and cookies. So quick breads would be like muffins, like banana bread, those kinds of things. And cookies, some cookies, softer cookies especially, work with applesauce as a replacement. I've had brownies that are made from prune puree, and you wouldn't be able to tell that there's prune puree in it unless somebody told you. So that's another neat trick. Of course, it's hard to say prune puree. So the guilt-free tip number 5. If you're going to buy an already pre-made dessert, and there's nothing wrong with that, I'm not going to be like bake shaming anybody. Like, I don't always bake everything that I eat either. So if you want to buy a pre-made dessert product, you always want to look at the label. The label is not just there for decoration. It's not there just because the government says it has to be there. I mean, it is, but it's also there for you to help the consumer just to make a proper determination about the things that they're eating. Well, Gail, you got a point there. I saw that pop up. Prunes are generally used for alleviating constipation. So if you ate too many of those brownies at one time, that may contribute to that. So yes, keep that in mind if you're using prune puree for something. So you want to look for things like trans fat. Again, you want to look for added sugars. You can see on this label here, you can see where it says total carbohydrates 45 grams, fiber, total sugars, and then underneath total sugars, it says includes 15 grams of added sugar. Again, that's a fairly recent addition to the label, and those are some of the things that you'd want to look at. Trans fats are also supposed to be labeled and let you. Trans fats are bad because of the way that the molecules are shaped. They're more likely to clump together and cause a blockage. So that's why trans fats are considered unhealthy, because they are more likely to clump together in your body and create like problems for your circulation. And so those have been on the label for a long time, but added sugars as a specific line has been just a fairly recent addition. And those are always good to see, just to check and see if there's a low percentage of those or not. So those are kinds of some of the things that you want to avoid if you're going to buy home already baked items. And this goes for if you go to a bakery at a grocery store, they should have the same information on their labels. It may not look like this, but it would be printed out on the label because they're required to also provide that information. It doesn't have to just be like stuff from the freezer case or anything like that. Guilt-free tip number 6. Desserts with a yogurt base are a healthier option than those with a cream cheese or sour cream or other items that have high saturated fat. Now, this also ties back to the first tip, which was using lower fat versions of these items. So if you just really don't like the taste of plain or vanilla yogurt, you can just use lower fat cream cheese or lower fat sour cream and get fewer calories and fewer fat grams, and still keep the flavor and the consistency that you want. I always warn people against going too extreme and trying to use the fat-free versions, because the fat-free versions, usually have more sugar. Because you're taking the fat out, they have to add something in to make it taste good. So they usually take out the fat and add more sugar. And then a lot of times you'll have a lot of water in those products. So you'll see it'll be like really watery compared to the full fat version. And that could, because baking relies so heavily on chemistry, could alter the consistency of some of the things that you're making. So you don't want to go too extreme and just go, well, I'm just going to use fat-free everything. That's not really going to work for you that well. But you can make yogurt dips. You can stir in mixed berries and make a... People try to convince you that berries and yogurt is a dessert. You may believe it. I don't believe it, okay? But you can try to tell yourself that. But it is sweet. I usually eat it for breakfast. I don't eat it as a dessert, but whatever works for you. So if that could be a dessert in your world. It is just not a dessert in my world. So some wholesome ingredients. The word wholesome can be a little misleading because it's one of those words. It's like, oh, it sounds good. Like natural. A lot of drugs that are bad for your body are natural. So natural is not always a good thing. But wholesome just means in this context that they're more like whole grain kind of products, no additional sugars, no unnecessary fats, those kinds of things. So some wheat flours that are considered more wholesome than just your standard processed all-purpose flour would be whole wheat flour. So and they have whole wheat all-purpose flour too. So it's not as common. Like you'll see a huge section of white AP flour. You'll see a little bit of whole wheat. That's what you're going to want to look for. White or ivory whole wheat. There's actually white whole wheat flour as well. So it's just not brown, but it's still a whole grain. Whole wheat pastry flour. For most things that you're going to make, you're probably just going to use all-purpose flour, would be the most common, but you can get pastry flour, which is a different consistency and has a different protein percentage. Like cake flour and bread flour, they also have those two specific ones too. Every time I've made a cake or baked bread, I've just used AP flour and it's been fine. But you can have graham flour. Spelt flour, if you want to go like old school and get some spelt. That's what the picture of this, that's what this picture is spelt. So that's what it looks like when it's growing. And then of course, once it's processed and ground up, that's what it looks like. So it doesn't look that different from like wheat flour, regular wheat flour. But those, usually you would find something spelt flour like in a Whole Foods probably, or a more specialty food store. It's not probably going to be something super common that you'll find at Publix or Winn-Dixie or Walmart or something like that. So some low to no gluten grains and seeds for those my celiac friends who can't eat a lot of gluten. There are other options that you can get. And again, most of these are going to be found at a specialty food store. Unfortunately, they do cost a little more because the demand isn't as high. And the quantities that are produced are smaller, so they're going to be higher in price. But they include things like barley, rye, oats, cornmeal. Cornmeal's pretty common, but it is gluten-free. Sorghum, buckwheat, quinoa, millet, rice, and rice flour. You might not think that quinoa and millet go with desserts, but if you grind them up, they're like flour. Or you can add them as an additional nutritional ingredient to different types of desserts and add a little bit of fiber and additional nutrition without really sacrificing any flavor. So oats are pretty common, I'd say, but oats and cornmeal are probably pretty common on this list. A lot of them, barley, it depends. Barley flour, you can probably buy barley and grind it, and it'll be easier to find the barley than the barley flour, but sometimes you can find it, like some brands, Red Mill or whatever it's called. I am not endorsing them, but I'm just saying that's one brand that usually has these specialty flours. And you usually pay more and get less as things go. But these are going to be low to no gluten grains and seeds. A lot of these start out as grains. In this picture, we have millet. No, sorghum. I'm sorry, sorghum's what's in this picture. And so you can see that's how when they harvest it, it looks like that, and then they grind it up to make flour. And so those are some examples of some low to no gluten grains and seeds for folks who are either trying to avoid eating gluten for whatever reason or cannot eat gluten because of a celiac disease or something like that. So nuts and seeds are another great addition. Does anybody know what these are in this picture? Yes, exactly. Pepitas, pumpkin seeds. And they're a great addition to a lot of things, whether as a topping or as an addition, like throughout, like a muffin or something. I love pumpkin seeds. Just roasted as a snack are good too. But here's a variety of different kinds of nuts and seeds that can be used in desserts to add a little bit more protein, add a little bit more fiber and maybe even a rich, nuttier flavor without people thinking that they're eating something healthy. So we have almonds, chestnuts, chia seeds are. I put chia seeds in my yogurt in the morning. They do get they're good. It will absorb a lot of liquid, so they'll kind of expand once you put them in liquid. But they're a good addition to. They kind of look like poppy seeds before you put them in water, a little bit bigger. And so they're a great addition to different desserts as well. So I put flax in my yogurt as well. I get the ground flax, and that's an easy way to get that additional omega-3 fatty acids as well as fiber and protein. So those are these kinds of things you might not think that you put a lot of seeds in your dessert, but you can add like poppy seed muffins, sesame seeds, all kinds of stuff that you can put and incorporate throughout that you won't even notice are there once your finished product is complete and you're tasting it. Of course, you want to watch out for allergies. So a lot of people are allergic to tree nuts, peanuts, and like pecans, walnuts, those kinds of things. Almonds they can't eat, but I mean, you just want to make sure that you're not getting an allergen. But other than that, all of these types of nuts and seeds are going to be great additions to a dessert. And again, a lot of times once you put them in there and you've baked the product, you're not necessarily going to know it's in there, especially if you put it in as a ground. Then it's mixed up throughout. So when you're substituting things, there are some things to look out for. You can, if you don't want to use the whole grain flour, you don't have to. Most of the time, you can just simply swap out the whole grain flour in the same quantity with all-purpose flour, the white processed flour. I would say that you would want to you would want to get the unbleached kind of all-purpose flour, though. You would want to avoid the bleached flour because the bleaching process strips a lot of nutrients away from the final product. So you can get white AP flour that is unbleached. It may not be as white as the white AP flour, but you're going to avoid the that bleaching process stripping away all of those nutrients that you're going to want to keep. Do keep in mind, though, that the processed AP flour does not absorb as much liquid as the whole grains because it doesn't have that fiber in it that will suck up all the liquid. So you don't necessarily have to adjust the liquid. You're just going to have to bake the product a little longer to either evaporate some of that liquid out, or give it a chance to absorb it as the process goes. So you might have to adjust the cooking temperatures a little bit or the times. So the second tip would be walnuts and pecans are interchangeable in any form, whether it's ground, whether it's chopped, whether it's whole. So you can substitute walnuts with pecans, no matter what you're like. If you want ground up walnuts or ground up pecans, you can use one or the other. It's not that way across the board though. So if you were going to use like pistachios or something instead, it's not necessarily the same. So you can, let's see if I can explain this. So like if you want to use pistachios as a topper instead of pecans, like chopped pistachios, that's fine. You can just substitute it as a topping and you're not going to get, there's going to be no problem there. But if you're talking about ground nuts, you can't necessarily swipe out like ground pistachios with ground pecans or ground walnuts because the way they react in a chemical reaction during the baking process are going to be different. Walnuts and pecans are so similar that you can do that swapping easily, but those are really the only two. So you can't do the same thing with almonds. You can't do the same thing with hazelnuts. You can't do the same thing with peanuts that you can do with walnuts and pecans, which are more interchangeable. So you would want to just kind of, if you've never made that substitution before and all you had, like, for whatever reason, you just have like hazelnuts and you wanted to see if that was going to work, you just have to do a little bit of an experimentation with that and see how that would go. And the reason being that all these different nuts have different absorption rates, again, just like with the different flours, different absorption rates, different protein and fat content, which can affect the consistency and texture of the final product. So again, walnuts and pecans are basically almost the same thing. I mean, I know they taste different, but their makeup is very similar and they react similarly when you're baking. Substitution tip number 3. If you're just going to be mixing dried fruits into something, you can use any dried fruit you want. So if you're just adding it to like some sort of pudding or, you know, something like a custard after it's already cooked, then you can use any kind of dried fruit that you want. But if you're going to be taking the dried fruit and putting it in some sort of batter and then baking the batter, you would really need to use the fruits that are called for in the recipe. Because again, different dried fruits have different water, different amounts of water in them. And as they cook, they might be mushier and more watery than another kind. And you might get where your final product is really wet when you don't want that to happen. So you really need to follow the recipe recommendations if you're going to be blending them into something, cooking them into something. If you're just using them as a topping or you're just stirring them in the final product, you can use whatever you want. Neutral oil, like grapeseed oil, I'd say vegetable oil is pretty neutral. Canola oil is neutral. It's not super flavorful, is what they mean by neutral. Can be used in place of different kinds of oils, but not in the place of like butter or coconut oil, because of the fact that baking, again, is based so much on chemistry. If you if you substitute too many of the inputs that are called for in the recipe, then your outcome is going to be different. It's not going to necessarily come out the way you want. It may not rise the way you want. It may not taste the way you want. It may not be the color that you like. And so you want to just be careful about what you substitute. So some things are easy to substitute and some things are a little trickier. You may not get, like if it calls for olive oil and you use canola oil instead because that's all you have, the final product's going to come out just fine. The taste might be a little bit different because you don't have that olive oil flavor, but it's going to work out just fine in terms of consistency, texture, and how well it stays together. And mouthfeel, that's an actual thing that they test for. So how it feels when you're biting into it and chewing it in your mouth. Water can also be used in place of clear liquids or translucent liquids, translucent meaning that light shines through them. So anything like fruit juice, and even orange juice, even though orange juice isn't translucent, you can still use water instead. You're just not going to have that same kind of flavor. But things like juice or tea you can substitute with water. Again, they will work and the consistency will be just fine, even if they have less flavor overall. Because a lot of time, you've got to remember these recipes have been tested and taste tested with not just the people who are making them and creating them, but the people they test them on other people who will eat them. And so the proportions that you see like in a recipe book have been tested and been shown that people like the final result. So if it calls for juice or tea and you only have water or you choose to use water instead, you're still going to have that same texture really, but the flavor might not be as complex because you're taking away the flavor that is put in by the juice or the tea or whatever liquid you happen to be using. Now, things like milk or cream or coffee or any kind of cider where it's darker and more opaque, you cannot substitute water for that because those types of liquids have strong flavors that are necessary to get the final product that you want, and also have different consistencies and chemical makeups that are important for the baking process and the chemical reactions that occur. So you don't want to just swap out water for any old liquid. And it's only for the ones that you can, like tea and juice, that you can shine light through, really. So that's why they say translucent.